Hey guys, Dr. Justin Marcagiani here. Today we're going to be chatting about the gluten-Hashimoto's connection. Again, I got a scientific study we're going to talk about and review here today. Is there a connection between gluten and your thyroid? Well, let's dive in and we'll talk about that. Before we do, please smash that like button. It really helps the search algorithm. Again, if you're on Instagram, I'm going to have a lot of overlay images on the screen, so feel free to head over to justinhealth.com/YouTube channel and you'll be able to see it there. All right, guys, let's dive in. So first off, I saw a study that came by my desk, came out last year in the journal Nutrients called The Doubtful Justification of the Gluten-Free Diet in the Course of Hashimoto's Disease. Let me pull it up. I love studies like this because a lot of times there's it's quite frequently a lot of logical fallacies in a lot of these studies, and we'll kind of talk about that. Typically, first off, you have to define a gluten-free diet. Most people, when they define a gluten-free diet, it's a diet that is free of wheat, barley, rye, and maybe some oat that is cross-contaminated. That's the first thing. So you can be eating a breakfast full of oatmeal that's gluten-free, rice for breakfast, corn for dinner. And the problem with that is there is still a potential molecular mimicry cross-reactivity, i.e. if your friend sees your brother and then sees your cousin, there may be a family resemblance. So if you have an autoimmune condition like most thyroid disorders do, and you have antibodies present and you have a lot of gut permeability, meaning the food in your intestinal tract is moving into the bloodstream and your immune system is encountering it, well, there's a good chance you could be overstimulating your immune system. So the first thing I like to highlight in this study is the diet recommended or the diet used. Let's kind of break it down. They talk about using a gluten-free diet. When you go to the methods section and you actually see how they implemented it, and it's really interesting because they talk about here the recommended diet is instead an anti-inflammatory diet. It's interesting, right? Because ideally, I don't ever like to use the word gluten-free because people always jump to hey, let's do a whole bunch of grain, corn, oats, right? But a paleo, grain-free diet that is anti-inflammatory, nutrient-dense, and low toxin, because you can eat a lot of foods that have a lot of processed grains in there and a lot of processed flour, and guess what? It's still pro-inflammatory and nutrient-poor, not to mention you have a whole bunch of anti-nutrients and a lot of fermentables, FODMAPs. If you have gut issues or IBS, then that can be problematic. So a couple things out of the gate here. So first off, in this study, it talked about the fact that Hashimoto's impacts about 5% of all people in the world. 20% of those are women. Celiac disease impacts about 1% of the population, okay? Yet 5 to 8% of people who have celiac actually have Hashimoto. So what does that mean? That means you're 500 to 800% likely to have celiac if you have Hashimoto's, if you have a thyroid condition. That's very interesting. That's fascinating. Now, the problem with celiac diagnosis is that celiac diagnosis is a late stage diagnosis. It's like a Venn diagram, right? You can be gluten sensitive and not be celiac, right? And everyone who's gluten sensitive, everyone who's celiac is gluten sensitive, but not everyone who's gluten sensitive is celiac, because the celiac definition essentially requires a lot of damage to be present into the small intestinal tract. The microvilli, these finger-like projections that sit in the small intestines, they have to be worn down significantly. So when you look at when they scope your intestinal tract, they do an endoscopy, they give you what's called a Marsh score, like a Marsh 0 through, I think it's 4. And typically you don't really get into the celiac realm until you start hitting 2 and 3, where those villi start to get worn down and almost even flat. You can Google that Marsh score and you'll see that. And so it has to have a lot of chronic inflammation, a lot of chronic degradation. You need some certain translational enzymes like transglutaminase to be elevated as well, which those enzymes are typically present when there's damage to those microvilli. So that's kind of one thing to highlight out of the gates. I wanted to kind of go through a couple things here that made a big difference here to me. It talks about selenomethionine supplementation. It talked about the presence of celiac disease in a large percent of the population. Let me just kind of pause that here for a second. So my big issues out of the gates, I'll go through the study here on Monday a little bit more in depth. I'll have the things that highlighted that I want to review specifically. But the couple of things I saw in the study that were interesting. Number one, you can't jump on board with a gluten-free diet. A gluten-free diet could potentially be healthy. Like a steak, is that gluten-free? Yes. Is a handful of berries gluten-free? Yes. Is rice gluten-free? Is corn gluten-free, right? So you have to really, is it a whole food type of grain-free, anti-inflammatory, nutrient-dense diet? Yes. And so we really want to be using nutrient-dense, anti-inflammatory, low toxin type of foods, right? Low anti-nutrient food. That's super important. Number two, when we look at functional medicine and we compare it to like conventional medicine, the biggest problem with conventional medicine and research is they're comparing one variable at a time. So what does that mean? You have this health issue, high blood pressure. I'm going to just change one variable. What's that variable? Here's a blood pressure medication. It's an ARB, it's an ACE inhibitor, it's a hydrochlorothiazide water pill. This is the only intervention. And look, we see this drop in physiology, i.e. your blood pressure is dropping. That's the only thing that conventional medicine looks at, and they're able to isolate variables. The problem with that is in functional medicine land, when you see a patient, you're just by getting them hydrated, adding some electrolytes to their water, working on them getting to bed a little bit more, regulating their cortisol rhythm, getting some nutrient deficiencies addressed, getting their fatty acid profile better. Now they're going to be eating more anti-inflammatory fats, healthy grass-fed meats, fish oil, and less nut and seed-based oils. Now we're going to add in some selenium. Maybe they were doing higher dose iodine. Maybe they have dysbiosis. Maybe there's some toxicity or mold. So you can see in the functional medicine world, there's so many levers that we're pulling that when conventional medicine comes in and says, hey, we're going to just see, does this one intervention of cutting out wheat, barley, and rye make the difference? Well, problem is, in functional medicine world, we are lining up a diet that's way more broad spectrum and consistent, that has nutrient density, anti-inflammatory, low toxin, and we're leaning on all these other variables: blood sugar, nutrients, selenium, zinc, magnesium, fixing dysbiosis, fixing cortisol imbalances, fixing sleep issues, fixing hydration, fixing electrolytes. And this is part of the reason why when you go look at a study, oh, this thing didn't do that. Well, I mean, in the real world, it would take a decade to run a study just isolating every single variable I just did. And that's the problem with science. It's really meant for patentable drug research. Now, that being said, I'm not saying that you shouldn't have double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. I think case studies are better, where it's like, hey, you work with these patients, you made all these different changes, and this is the outcome, right? And you just report the patient's outcome. I think those are better because it allows you to put information out into the clinical research, and people can talk about, hey, these are the outcomes that are happening. But with double-blind, placebo-control type of studies, functional medicine does not work best with it because we're loading so many inputs into the system and we can't isolate them. So big recap out of the gates: gluten-free diets can still be a crappy diet. Newsflash, right? You still got to look at blood sugar issues, dysglycemia. You have to look at anti-inflammatory, nutrient density. Got to look at selenium. Got to look at zinc. Got to make sure your blood sugar is not wonky. Got to look at vitamin D. Got to look at precursors to glutathione. Got to look at magnesium. Got to look at sleep. Gut plays a major role because gluten, I think the major mechanism of how it impacts the thyroid. That's why there's 5 to 8x more people with Hashimoto's that also have celiac than the average person in the population. That means something. I think the big mechanism that I see with gluten in general, even non-celiac gluten sensitivity, is there's this gut permeability thing. When you increase gut permeability, leaky gut occurs. That's part of the whole process. The tight junctions open up. Food and endotoxin, now mycotoxins, get into the bloodstream. That aggravates the immune system. And then you have this surface protein reaction where you're seeing certain foods and they're attacking. They have similar protein patterns as other tissues in the body, and it causes the immune system to attack those tissues. And then, of course, when you have chronic gut issues and inflammation, I saw a patient last week that had parietal cell antibodies and had autoimmune issues. Well, what does that mean? Parietal cells make intrinsic factor to absorb B12. They also make hydrochloric acid. So when you have chronic gut issues, you may have low ability to absorb B12 and low ability to make stomach acid, and that which is really important for activating your enzymes. And stomach acid is so important for ionizing your minerals, for ionizing iodine, magnesium, calcium, selenium, zinc, right? Copper, really important nutrients for thyroid production, thyroid function. So I'll go over that study with you guys on Monday, but that's kind of my just thinking out of the gates here. When someone says a gluten-free diet doesn't work, what does that mean, right? First, define a gluten-free diet. Is an apple gluten-free? Yes. Is corn gluten-free? Yes. Ideally, you want to dial in your macronutrients, good proteins, good fats, ideally anti-inflammatory carbohydrates, good healthy anti-inflammatory carbs, and dial that in for you. Ideally, whole foods is better. The more Neolithic and more processed the food is, the more likely it is it's going to drive inflammation and cause problems if it's consumed in excess. Again, Dr. J here signing off. If you enjoyed today's video, let me know. I'll go and bring that study to you guys here on Monday, and we'll go through it a little bit more in depth. Shante writes in, what are the symptoms of celiac disease? So, celiac, you can have anything from just your IBS type of symptoms: bloating, gas, diarrhea, gastritis, stomach pain. You can also see a lot of nutrient deficiencies like B12 and low iron. So, of course, that's going to also drive mood issues, brain fog, and fatigue. Again, celiac, don't love that. It's an end-stage diagnosis. Gluten sensitivity is a better thing to look at. I say most of the population is gluten sensitive. The best way to look for gluten sensitivity, I think, is an elimination provocation diet. That's number one. There's a lot of reasons why you may feel better coming off of grains in general. One is FODMAPs. Two is anti-nutrients. Three is just if you're subbing the grains and you're adding in green vegetables or some other good protein or fat instead, now you're increasing nutrient density, right? More minerals, more phytonutrients, less anti-inflammatory load. How long to heal the gut? It just depends, right? I've seen patients with ulcerative colitis and chronic IBD, irritable bowel disease. It may take 1 to 2 years. Now, during that time frame, they're going to get significantly better each month, but they may have calprotectin or eosinophilics that's off the charts, and it takes time to heal and bring that inflammation down. I think the average person, 6 months is a very good time frame, but I think within 2 to 3 months, you can get your function up to pretty normal, where you're eating most meals, you're feeling like you're, I would say maybe 4 to 6 months, pretty normal, where you're eating each meal, you're feeling pretty good, you're breaking things down, you have good motility, you're digesting things. And again, if you're not, then there could be other bugs going on. There could be other potential mold colonization in your gut as well. Chronic low stomach enzymes, low HCl, maybe just chronic stress. So you got to look at the whole picture so you have a complete picture. You don't just want to go in on it's this one thing. You want to be open to all possibilities. And sometimes it's, hey, it's 10% this, 20% that, 30% that. It's very rarely, hey, it's 99% this one thing. It can be, but a lot of times it's not. And you have to be open so you kind of can look at every single variable and make sure you attack it based on priority. All right, guys, Dr. J here. If you enjoyed it, let me know. Thumbs up. Sharing is caring. Appreciate it. Share with friends or family. If you want to reach out, link down below for my coordinates. If you want to get a hold of me to kind of dial in, roll up the sleeves, and figure out what's going on with your own personal health. All right, guys, take care. Have an awesome weekend. Bye now.